Thank you for joining the state policy session this afternoon, the last breakout of the day, so kudos for you for sticking it out, and thank you for the panel for joining me. My name is Chris Beling. I work for the Environmental Protection Agency here in New England. We go by EPA New England, and I have the pleasure of working with 6 of our New England states, Connecticut up to the state of Maine. And I like to think, are very progressive in the area of food waste or wasted food. And I have to say, I was chatting with Greg earlier today, we've been working on wasted food in this region since 1996. So despite the fact that it got very sexy in 2011, thank you NRDC for making it sexy, and for the Harvard Food Law Policy Clinic, The Dating Game, what a clever title. It's been an issue up in New England states for a long time from the waste management angle, so it's a pleasure to share what we've been doing here. And then also to branch out to our West Coast colleague, Ashley, who will talk about some work that's going on in Oregon. So before we start, it's a relatively small group today. Just give me a sense of who is in a state agency here. All right. Not-for-profits? Okay. Funders? Nice. Other feds? Thank you so much. And who I forgot? The media. Yes. All right. So thanks. Industry. Well, there you go. Thank you so much, Laura. I appreciate that. So I just wanted to get a sense of the room for the speakers, so we move forward. I'm not going to read bios because they're in our packages, but I think we're going to start with Sue AnderBois, who's my colleague from the state of Rhode Island, who works for the governor's office. And Sue is titled the Director of Food Strategy. And I have to be honest, she is unique, at least in the New England states. She is the only Director of Food Strategy I've ever met. So it's a pleasure to introduce Sue.
Awesome. How do I, slides over there? Is that how I move them? Oh, cool. Whatever
you would like.
Okay.
Whatever feels good for you. Cool.
Can you guys hear me? It's also a small room, so I can just speak. I can use my outdoor voice. Awesome. So thank you guys so much. I'm really excited to be here with you today and talk a little bit about some of the work that we are doing in Rhode Island and some of the work we would like to be doing in Rhode Island. And I'm going to give just a little background. A lot of times when I tell folks that I'm the Director of Food Strategy for the state of Rhode Island, they're a little bit like, what's that? So I'm going to start with that. Just to kind of set the stage. So this is a position that I've held for 2 years. It's a new position for Rhode Island. We think we might still be the only state with a statewide Director of Food Strategy. And also want to give a shout to our friends at the Kendall Foundation who were really supportive of this for the last 2 years. And so what is the food strategy? So I was hired 2 years ago with kind of a dual purpose in mind. So part of it was to say, wow, food is kind of all-encompassing. It's an incredibly important thing for our state, for all of your states. But our state in particular decided, and our governor, Governor Raimondo, decided this was particularly important. And it was really cross-cutting across our agencies. So food touches on just about all of our agencies. I won't name them all, but some of the ones most engaged are like our Commerce Agency, our Health Agency, our Department of Environmental Management, which in Rhode Island uniquely houses our Agricultural Agency, as well as our Fisheries Agency, Education. So part of the idea was to say, wow, food is so cross-cutting and so important, we need to be able to kind of de-silo it across state government so that we, all of our agencies sing a slightly different note, but we all need to sing off the same sheet of paper when it comes to food. And so part of my role is to kind of be that kind of smoother across agencies so that when we show up in a place, we're all speaking off that same sheet of music. And then the second was, what is that piece of music we're singing? And so we didn't have it. We didn't know. And so in Rhode Island, we had so many amazing things going on across our food system, so many really great pieces, but we didn't yet know, like, what are we trying to do? Like, what are our biggest opportunities and what are our kind of biggest weaknesses, and how are we kind of going after that in a strategic way? So for my first year, it was a lot of creating, this is a picture of our food strategy, creating the Rhode Island food system strategy, which we call Relish Rhode, and it's available on our website, relishrhode.com. We try and be very consistent in all of our messaging. Got our little anchor with fork and spoon. And the idea of that is if you guys can see, really to look holistically at the whole food system and find those areas of greatest opportunity and tackle some of our areas of greatest weakness. So behind me, in front of you guys, I'll just kind of give a high level of where food waste fits in here, but we look at everything through kind of three major lenses. So our three lenses through which we look at everything as it relates to food are, how does it relate to public health and equitable access to food? Does it promote environmental sustainability and climate resiliency? And does it create opportunities for economic development? And those are not meant to be looked at in silos. So it's not like, okay, checked a box, it does one of those, great, let's move forward. That graphic intentionally, is pointing right at that middle. We had a graphic for a while that was a little bit of a Venn diagram, but really showing that the food strategy is looking for opportunities where we leverage all three of those. And so the sweet spot where those three lenses meet are where those 5 other things behind me, we call them integrated focus areas, because they're the major areas of focus for the food strategy that integrate those 3 major lenses. And I'll say them all out, but you'll see one is in a box, or it should be in a box. Oops, skipped ahead too fast.
Next one.
Excellent. I hit too many buttons at once. But the 5 major areas of the food strategy, the 5 focus areas, are, and these are in no particular order, these are all of equal weight. Folks ask this all the time, like, you said that in a different version, different weight than last time, or different order, this one must be the most important. They're all of equal importance. So I'll say them in an order, but I could say them in any order. So we really want to make sure we're preserving and growing our agriculture and fisheries industries in the state. And I can afterward talk about any of these in more detail with you. Kind of the flip side to preserving and growing our agriculture and fisheries in the state is, to help expand market opportunities for those industries, as well as our prepared and processed foods. Kind of undergirding both of those is making Rhode Island kind of like the place to own, operate, grow, whatever action verb you want to use, a food business. And so that's been a lot of like regulatory and other kind of regulatory and like financial programs related to food systems. We also have a focus area around ensuring food security for all Rhode Islanders, as well as a commitment to reduce food insecurity levels in the state to below 10%. Which is something only 5 states period in the country have achieved. We are not currently one of them, but we are on the path to do so. And then last but not least, why we're all here today is a really big focus on, as we think about the food strategy or the food system as a whole, not to forget about waste and to look at ways that we can be both reducing waste and then diverting it from our traditional waste stream, which is what you all care about most and why you're here today. And in Rhode Island, it's especially present on people's mind because we have one central landfill. Rhode Island is a very small place. We're very densely populated. We have one central landfill that has maybe 15 to 20 years left in its lifespan. So I'm going to jump into that. We break the food strategy, or that section of the food strategy, up kind of into 3 pieces. Luke might recognize a friend of his on my slide from a picture I took with them. So we break it up into 3 pieces. So the first is, how do we minimize food waste kind of at the source? And I can talk about some of the programs we've started to do, that's on the next slide, that help get at that. The second is, as we're then diverting it from the waste stream, we want to think, this is common sense to you guys, both about both food that's still totally edible and safe, and how do we get that to Rhode Islanders in need, versus food that is unsafe, spoiled, or, just actual waste, and how do we keep that out of our central landfill? So those 3 pieces. The pictures up above are from Rhode Island events. This is Clay, who used to work with Luke at Food Solutions. In the middle is the Rhode Island Food Bank with Rhode Island Community Food Bank with some volunteers from Roger Williams University. And on the end is actually an example of, we actually don't really have great infrastructure for diverting compost and unusable food waste in Rhode Island. This is a picture of our waste recycling facility, our recycling, like our non-food waste recycling facility for like plastic and paper and things like that. Oops, I keep hitting it too hard. So we have kind of 4 major areas that we've been pushing on for implementation around the food waste part of the food strategy. So the food strategy was released just about 1 year ago, and so these are the things that we've immediately started working on. And we are now in planning phases for kind of fiscal year 2019 and moving forward. But 4 of our kind of initial projects. First is, we partnered with our 6 of our colleges and universities, we have 12 colleges and universities in the state. We offered this opportunity to all 12. 6 took us up on it. 5 have been really actively engaged, connecting them with actually food, with PH. Luke is in the back. Their software program that helps universities track and measure their food waste. And then offer tips for reductions. That was something we introduced to them as kind of a competition, cooperation, co-opetition kind of thing, where they could, work collectively, but then also, have a little bit of friendly competition. So 6-ish of our 12 colleges and universities signed up for that. We'll be working on writing up a case study of that program over the summer. So that was from January through graduation for the schools, and so they've just wrapped up, and we'll be going through that data and also kind of wrapping up, what some of the best practices we learned were, what went well, what didn't go well, and what are some other things that they or other large producers of food waste like them can engage with going forward. The second one, if we just go to the right, and this is something unique in Rhode Island, this wasn't necessarily something we're like, oh, this is how we're implementing the food strategy, but concurrently, our General Assembly kicked off a food waste study commission. So sometimes, I think all of our states in New England do things like this, but if they have an idea of something that they really want to work on, but they don't necessarily really yet know what the policy solution is, they'll instead pass a bill that creates a study commission. So a group of, I think it was like 10 to 12 of us were invited to participate in the study commission, diving into food waste issues over the course of the last several months. And so it was folks from different agencies, so I sat on it. I had colleagues from the Department of Health who sat on it. Interestingly, our Department of Environmental Management was not asked to sit in on it, so I kind of played a little bit of double duty, so that was kind of an interesting thing that happened. But they had folks from the food bank, from hunger centers, from all different places, as well as several representatives from the General Assembly. And we heard presentations from folks across the state, from our central landfill, from the folks from the Center for Ecotechnology. We had Karen from Whole Foods came and talked about their program. So really trying to dive in, what are some of the big solutions that we could be doing or working on as a state? Should we be working on labeling? Should we be working on X, Y, and Z? But looking at it from the lens of a member of the General Assembly. And so they had their last meeting earlier this month, and we'll be putting out a little write-up about what their recommendations are for next session. But some of the big themes that came up, which will be no surprise to you guys, were, I'd say, fall into 2 buckets, one of which was the need for more technical assistance support for our generators of food waste, or just our business community in general. So we have a food waste recycling law in Rhode Island. Most businesses are technically compliant because you need to be within 15 miles of the nearest anaerobic digester or composting facility. And spoiler alert, we don't really have any of those. So we're technically compliant, but in the opposite of how you'd like to be compliant. And so finding ways to be able to connect our businesses with the programs that do exist. So we do have some compost facilities. We have a new anaerobic digester who's coming on board. There's, as you guys know, some great resources that exist around food waste, potentially wasted food and diverting that to folks in need. And businesses just don't have access to that information. And so one thing we identified was needing funding to support that type of technical assistance and bringing that into the state, either through contracting, like the way other states have done it, or by building up our state agencies to do that themselves, leaning heavily toward we should contract out in a way other states have done. And then the second piece was around, how can we clean up some of our regulatory language so that we better encourage food donations in the state. So being really clear about some of our labeling rules and liability rules and things like that. And so I think we did have legislation that was introduced this year. Our legislature just got out like a day ago, so I have to look up to see if that all passed. But there would be the idea of the study commission is now, there could be proposals made for the 2019 session. So like a lot of your states, we have a part-time legislature, so they go January through June. I think just Massachusetts and New England is different. And then to the other side, and then I'll let other folks talk, but one of our other major initiatives actually came out of our Department of Health. They are working on an initiative they call the Rhode to End Hunger, pun intended with the word road in there. And the idea there was something that's come up very frequently. probably not just in our state, but that a big impediment to a lot of food businesses donating potentially wasted food is kind of this fear of what's going to happen to me if I donate. Am I going to get in trouble? Is the Department of Health going to shut me down? I'm not sure what the rules are. I'm confused. And so the Department of Health said, hey, we actually really want to facilitate this. I know we're kind of seen a little bit as the big bad guy. We are not the big bad guy. We want to be your friend. And so they put together this initiative, the Road to End Hunger. Some of the initial things they've done as part of that, and that was intentionally part of our implementation of the food strategy, really them seeing their role as part of, facilitating a better food system for the state. So a few of the things they've done, one is they've put together, and in partnership with EPA and a few other folks, kind of this like 2-page document that's got their big old logo on it that says, please, donate, but also here's some of the things you need to do to make sure it stays safe. And having their big old logo like right on the front of that thing was actually probably the most important part of it existing, so that when businesses see it, they're like, oh, I can do this and not get in trouble. If it had my logo on it, a little less important. If it just had EPA's logo, that would mean a little bit, it would mean about the same as my logo probably, but having the Department of Health really get behind it is really important. They've also partnered with the Hospitality Association, which has several hundred members across the state of both restaurants and places like, large hotels and event spaces. So they're getting that message out to all of their members as well as the Department of Health as they go out to inspect places, making sure that they physically hand this and mention it to the companies. And so that's been one piece. The second was we didn't have a really great mapping in the state of all of our food pantries and meal sites. So they existed in kind of like bits and pieces. We had the 55 agencies that our community food bank works with, but they don't obviously work with everybody for various reasons. And then, there's like the little pockets everywhere. So they work to make that whole list of everybody. And not all food pantries need to get licensed by state departments of health. And so that wasn't, a lot of people were like, oh, well, obviously you just have that in your databases. We're like, oh, heads up, like they don't actually have to get licensed. So, making sure we had that list, that people felt comfortable sharing their information with us as pantries and meal sites, that we weren't trying to do anything, shut them down or anything that they were uncomfortable with, but really just wanted to make sure that they had resources available to them. And so one, created that map, and then two, and made sure that that map and that information was shared with folks across the food industry who might be interested in donating. And then they also created a partnership with a group called Means, who I'm not sure if Means is here today, but they're like other organizations that are here. It's kind of like a dating service for food waste producers and food, like folks who can intake donated food. And so they created this partnership with Means, starting with one major meal site in Rhode Island, which is called Macaulay House, which is in the south side of Providence, and a few bigger donors. So Johnson & Wales University, you guys may have heard of them. They're based in Providence. They're one of the largest culinary schools in the country. Their flagship is in Providence. So they were kind of one of the first partners on that as well. So those have all kind of been parts of their that Road to End Hunger piece. So those are some of the initial things that we've done. We're also, it says partnerships and technical assistance, have done some really great events. We're planning an event with EPA, in partnership with EPA for the fall, to kind of move all this forward and say like, okay, there's all this stuff bubbling up. How do we, we're at this great point where there could be a tipping point. How do we tip the ball over the side? And so that'll be in September. And really just trying to make sure that these connections are getting made and that we're kind of looking at food waste in this very coordinated context of the food system overall, and not just, we're not thinking about waste just in a silo. We're not just thinking about waste as the waste department and the Department of Environmental Management, even though they're thinking about it all the time. We're thinking about it coordinated across the whole food system and the other stuff that's going on. So I will cede because I'm out of time, but I'm really excited to be here with you guys and chat more about how we can be working together.
Thank you, Sue. And so I have to be honest, like I said, I have a great job. I get to work with my 6 New England states, and Sue is kind of a newer player for us. They're the 4th state that have kind of started to implement some of the legislation and regulation here in New England. They also have one health department in their state. Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. So for those of you in Massachusetts, city health departments, I've heard other county health departments, we have one layer in Rhode Island. Yeah. So that's kind of a luxury. So it makes things a teeny bit easier. So more to come on that. So my next state personally involved with is the Massachusetts DEP, and Greg Cooper is here. You might have heard Greg's colleague John Fisher mentioned in the opening comments of Chris Cochran. I think Massachusetts has made a big impression on ReFed and the work that they've been doing literally for 20 years to implement an organics ban. And some of us in the room have been here for that whole ride. So it's really an amazing thing to see come to fruition. So, Greg?
Thank you, Chris. I think everyone can hear me. So, yeah, John Fisher would love to be here, but actually he's on vacation, so I don't think he really would want to be here. But I did, looking around, I'm like, I would have gotten such better grades if I was in a room like this studying than sitting in whatever state university I went to for a while, and these $500 chairs, I would have gotten straight in. So anyway, let's get to the approach here. So I'm Greg Cooper. I'm the Director of Business Compliance and Recycling at MassDEP, and solid waste is one of the areas that I'm kind of under, and John works for me on commercial waste, and I have someone on the residential side also. So my contact information is there. Which button do I hit? The one? Where am I pointing?
Yep.
Yeah, you hit
it. All right. So as you can see, I'm highly technical and love pictures and drawings and stuff. So my slides might dazzle you a little. So what's our approach in Massachusetts, and how did we get started on this? So I mean, basically we've been doing, as Chris said, working on this for a long time. And in our 2010 to 2020 solid waste master plan, where we talk about what we want to do, obviously given that food waste is a significant portion of the waste stream, we had to kind of figure out how we were going to try and address that. And the main tool that DEP and Massachusetts uses in its regulatory toolbox of managing waste is what we call a waste disposal ban, which basically says you can't throw that in the trash anymore. Actually, it says you cannot contract for the disposal of these materials, whether it's tipped at the disposal facility or picked up at a commercial establishment. And in this context, what we did for the waste ban is we established a waste ban for what we titled commercial organic material, which was any commercial entity that was disposing of over a ton a week of food material. And was basically saying you can no longer do that, you need to set up some sort of program to divert that material away from the waste, or you may get in trouble with us. Its focus, obviously, we had worked for many years prior to this. We had working with supermarkets and college universities and correction facilities and hospitals and the such, kind of working on different projects with these folks, and we felt it was kind of time to move forward with the regulatory component of it. One of the main aspects of what we have, and it's on our website, is our organics action plan. This was done back when we were developing the solid waste master plan. We continually update that plan, and it covers a number of topics, cutting from data analysis. We did organics mapping to kind of identify where the commercial generators were, because the haulers are going to want to know that. Who are the customers that are going to have to comply? We did in the area of reducing waste and donating of food. We have guidance and BMPs for generators on how they can establish, diversion programs, better buying practices. A lot of that effort, and also a lot of the effort in that area is done through a program we started called Recycling Works in Massachusetts, and it's run by the Center for Technology. Lorenzo's over there. They've been a fantastic contractor. We pay them to do it all. It gives comfort to the regulated community that knows that DEP is not going to be walking through their facility, but somebody else who is going to help them comply with DEP's rules. And they've done a magnificent job of creating a whole host of guidance and best management practices, and also have been working with the Harvard Food Law on some of these issues of where, how the reuse and the donation can work for these businesses. Collection infrastructure, same thing. We did a lot of pilot collection efforts, both in-store or in establishment, but also the collectors themselves, best management practices, did a lot of technical assistance comes once again from the Recycling Works program. They go out, walk through an operation, tell them exactly what they need to do. It's all free of charge for that business, and gives them insight as how they can make this commercial organics ban work for them. And in most cases, we find out that it works not only for them to comply, but it works financially for them too. The other piece was processing capacity. Obviously, you start collecting all this stuff, you got to have somewhere for it to go. So we made an effort to work on processing capacity, providing funding, grants, low interest loans, and incentives for those companies to kind of invest in their infrastructure. Started out with a lot of composting operations. Now it's going into anaerobic digestion operations, animal feed operations. A lot of different ideas are coming forth, and I'm a supply side economics person. My feeling is you put a whole bunch of pile of stuff that's been sorted from something else and you make a big pile of it, somebody's going to figure out what to do with it. And lo and behold, at least in Massachusetts, that's what's happening. Regulatory reform was another piece that we have of our organics plan, and that was very important. One was trying to make it easier for a composting facility or recycling organics AD operation, animal feed, make it easier for them to get permitted, make it easier for them to site and locate in Massachusetts. That's an important aspect of our regulations, and we reformed the regulations in 2012 and provided that a little bit easier pathway to get that siting. And then there was the waste ban itself. So basically, I think I covered all that.
Computer.
To ask, where do you shoot it? Am I doing that right?
You should have to press a little harder, I found.
Okay. All right. So as I said, the kind of key elements of that whole organics action plan and the ban and implementing it really comes down to working extensively with the stakeholders. You know, as I said, we've been working with a lot of these folks for many years. Supermarket industry, we were, you know, lockstep, walking down for probably since 2000, working with them, or not earlier, on how we're going to address the issue of food waste coming out of their operations. So we had large stakeholder groups as part of our solid waste master plan process. We had, I think, 3 different subcommittees within our plan development. From market development to collection to, you know, the diversion and reuse, and that was very important to the development of that action plan. And we continue to meet with those subcommittees through our ongoing master plan solid waste activities. You know, it was very deliberate in the way that we rolled out our program. We know, you know, you got to do the upfront work with the regulated community, provide them the options, explain how it's going to work before you can actually institute the regulatory mechanism, and in this case, the ban. Lo and behold, it was great. By the time we got to the point of 2014, we felt really comfortable about where we were. I've done a lot of waste bans. I've banned the disposal of cathode-ray tubes, I've banned the disposal of paper, I've banned disposal of yard waste. You name it, I don't think, there's not a lot of things you can throw away in the trash in Massachusetts, so you might want to look at the list. We're going to change it, we're going to flip it and say, this is what you can throw away. But this one, in all honesty, it sounded like the most horrifying one to begin with. By the time we reached this process, we felt really comfortable. There was not a squawk about us instituting this waste ban, and that's because of the upfront work that John and Recycling Works and other folks who are participating in those subcommittees designed a really good program. And so we, you know, basically it was supported, it was cost effective, there were outlets for the operations, and that had to do with providing enough time before instituting the ban to allow that infrastructure to build and grow. Thank you. All right. So, results. So one of the things that we like to do when we can, and in this case we were able to, is kind of see the impacts of all of the effort that went forward. In 2016, we hired a consulting firm to do an economic benefits analysis of the impact of the ban. And it did a surveying mechanism of haulers, composting operations, anaerobic digestion facilities, and animal feed, and including the reuse, the food donation component. And they did an entire I'm not an economics, but they did the M-plan, which is a modeling technique in terms of proven modeling technique of deriving the benefits of a particular sector and industry through identifying employment and payroll and revenue. And the outcomes that came out of that we felt were extremely positive. At the time we did the study, it was supporting about 900 jobs in the Commonwealth and about 175 million in economic activity. We had some direct employment at the time of the study was about 500. We also asked the consulting firm to ask the industry and different representatives about what their future looked like in the next year. And in that, we saw unemployment growth go from the base of 2016 of 500 to an estimated 750. So a 50% growth in employment within a year. We also saw total employment, which is this kind of total indirect and peripheral, go from 900 to 1370. So, obviously, my job's protecting the environment, but when I can connect it with, hey, this is creating jobs, it makes buy-in really easy across the board within the government. Lastly, one of the other things that we asked is, so what are you going to do in the future? How much investment are you going to make? And from when it's extrapolated through the system, it came out to about $50 million in new investment going in to the infrastructure. Uh-oh. How about you help me out? That's it. Good. All right. So some other results to date. We continue to monitor what's happening with the implementation of the ban and all the elements that we have supporting it, from financial programs, technical assistance programs. We've seen overall diversion grow from 100,000 tons to 260,000 tons. We do a lot of internal evaluation, particularly in the area of the food donation. We just got done with having someone perform some of that work for us. We've seen food donation go up 22% from 2014 to 2017. That actually was 21,000 tons up to 26,000 tons of food waste donated. And then on the subset of the food rescue component, we saw that grow by 60% between that time from 2014 to 2017 for a total of 1,500 ton increase. And for those of you not in the waste business, that's 3 million pounds. I always talk in tons and everyone talks in pounds. So, but a lot of food waste, a lot of good things happening. We saw growth in the hauling side of things with the customer growth. Once again, our Recycling Works contractor, CET, works and contacts the haulers and surveys them, and found out that the number of accounts that they have that are doing organics diversion has grown substantially from 1,300 to 2,100. The other good positive thing we said, I always talk about development of an infrastructure is kind of like an inchworm. You need to have the supply, then you need to have the demand. Then you need to have the supply, you need to have the demand. Because if one outpaces the other, you got problems. Either you got, processing operations or end users closing because they can't get enough material, or you got piles of stuff that you don't know what to do with. And in this case, we've seen an excellent growth on the capacity side also. It's particularly the compost facilities really were our bridge. You can only have so many composting operations. They have tough times. We've seen anaerobic digestion grow to 300,000 tons. It's going to have another 600, up to 600,000 very shortly as more come online. And the next piece we have is 6 new deep packaging facilities. What we found when we advanced up, we had a lot of people coming in saying, I've got packaged food waste and no one wants to take it. And so we've invested a lot of grant dollars into assisting operations to put in deep packaging units. And thus far we've got 6. We've got 2 more coming online, and they've been extremely successful. So overall, I think John Fisher has done a fantastic job. I've done my management duty of letting him go do what he needs to do, and he does it very well. So that's it.
Thank you. The other thing I'd like to point out, you notice he said contract dollars for Center for Ecotechnology, and he said grant dollars to support infrastructure. Very big difference among our states in terms of the resources that they've put behind some of these food waste bans and the resources they have to do that. So Massachusetts, I always say, is the gold standard. And we're very grateful for that. So let's switch to the West Coast. Ashley Zanolli, many of you probably know Ashley from her work in the food waste measurement space. Ashley and I were colleagues when she worked for EPA Region 10, and it's a pleasure to introduce her today as part of the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality.
Thanks, Chris. It's a pleasure to be with you today. And I'm going to stand up and change slides. So I'm going to take you through Oregon's journey around wasted food. And I have a lot of home state pride. I'm actually originally from Rhode Island, about 45 minutes away, so it's great to hear what everyone's up to. And before I kind of walk you through the journey and where we're at with measurement and how it can advance policy work, I just want to talk about how we talk about wasted food in Oregon. So we don't really talk about food waste. We talk about wasted food. So that's the portion of food that could have been eaten, things like berries that went bad in the back of your fridge, or maybe a half sandwich you didn't finish at lunch today. And wasted food is part of food waste, but ideally we want to be sending inedible food scraps to the kind of infrastructure that Greg's talking about. I mean, who here, raise a hand? Raise your hand if you think food that's grown to feed people should be ideally composted and digested. Any takers? Not today. There was actually one person at the Waste Expo I went to that did raise their hand. It was pretty funny. And nothing new here, you know, food is getting a lot of attention, especially wasted food. I thought it was funny that the tagline for Nat Geo's food, or Too Good to Waste, similar to EPA's commercial campaign around preventing wasted food, and Project Drawdown, we heard from Chad. And you know, Chad didn't really have enough time to go into the talk that Paul Hawking normally gives with a bit more detail. And one thing that I found a little confusing, and maybe you did too, is how we use the word reduce. So because so many states only have policies around reducing food waste to landfills, I've found in the past couple of years, I'm having a conversation I think I'm having with someone, we're actually having 2 different conversations. So in Oregon, we talk about reducing the generation of food that was grown to feed people that didn't feed people. So it's food that could have fed people or didn't need to be produced in the first place. And that doesn't mean farmers are making less money, it actually means farms can be more profitable. And in Drawdown, number 3 is prevention. So number 60 is anaerobic digestion, number 30 is composting, number 3 is really about prevention with a little bit of greenhouse gas benefits from donation. So I just want to be clear that that's reducing the generation of wasted food, which is really what we're working on in Oregon as well. And I'm going to walk you through how we got there. So we didn't start there. Department of Environmental Quality, before I joined, was very much a solid waste agency. And there was some landmark legislation I'll get to in a moment in 2015 that opened up the door to really practice sustainable materials management in the way EPA defines it. And I'm just going to show you how we got to the goals we did because we were really surprised by the results. So let's use 2015 as a base year just to show you recovery goals. And in Oregon, when we talk about recovery, we're not talking about donation. We're actually talking about recycling and a lot of the work Greg just discussed. So in 2015, we had about 500,000 tons of food that was disposed. And we had an actual recovery rate of 8%. So based on that rate, you can see the greenhouse gas benefits, and the offsets are in that really tiny orange bar. So there's a little bit of a benefit. Obviously, we have a lot of room to grow in doing food recovery and recycling. So let's pretend we actually hit our statewide goal, which is to recover or recycle 25% of food scraps by 2020. So let's pretend we hit that in 2015. If we were to recover 25% of food scraps through diversion, we would offset even more. It's about a 30% reduction. It looks really good if your core area of focus is the solid waste system. Well, we know that food doesn't just appear and exist in the solid waste system. It's grown on a farm. It goes through a lot of steps before it gets to us. So let's bring in all those upstream emissions. So what would that look like? Well, it looks a little different. And the bottom chart you hear shows you what you can get through a generation goal. So that's a prevention goal aligned with number 3 in drawdown. And our goal at the state is to reduce the generation of wasted food that could have fed people by 40% by 2030. So you can see kind of the dramatic difference when you start to look at it across the full supply chain. And I know not every state or city is like Oregon, but I think it's important to frame our work within the food system so that we can really achieve the higher level environmental outcomes we're all after, as well as the social ones, since there's a lot of love and energy that goes into producing food, so we want to make the most of it. And this is why mindset matters, because unlike other approaches, Oregon's really latched on to thinking about how to minimize the full life cycle impacts from, in this case, growing food on land, potentially manufacturing, processing, and distributing that until it's ultimately recovering those edible scraps or disposing of it in other ways. And the work that enabled this process is embedded in Oregon's 2050 vision, which was adopted by our Environmental Quality Commission in 2013. So that's kind of like DEQ's environmental board, you could think of it as. And it was adopted in legislation in 2015 through 2 landmark Senate bills, Senate Bill 245 and 263. One authorized the funding and created 7 new roles, one of which is mine that I was brought in on loan from EPA to fulfill. And what it allowed us to do is move from a solid waste authorizing environment to an environment where we shifted from end of life to acknowledging the full life cycle. We shifted from just minimizing impacts of waste, which is really important, but not only doing that, but looking at all the environmental impacts across that life cycle. And moving from a primary focus on regulatory tools to a broader suite of tools, things like financial incentives, voluntary engagement with industry, and applied research, some of which I'll share with you that I've been leading for the last couple of years. And when I first came to DEQ in 2016, we had a team and we developed a strategy. So what are we going to do over the next 5 years? What's our strategy to prevent the wasting of food? And within that strategy, it was driven by these 3 goals. So how do we build the base of knowledge? When I first came on, all we knew was that we have food waste. There's a big pile of food waste. We don't know what's in it. We don't know how much of it could have been eaten. We don't know how much of it was avoidable. The other goal is to really look at how to increase business and consumer action around preventing wasted food. Which actions are most effective? And then this goal around generation is really tying our policy metric to the actual environmental outcomes. So we're reducing the generation of wasted food by 40% and all of the associated greenhouse gas emissions, water, energy use, and other resources that go into producing food. And the tagline for the 2050 vision is conserving resources, protecting the environment, and living well. And there's a whole body of work around that I won't get into, but I encourage you to check it out. It's really interesting and quite novel, in my opinion. And the thing that confuses me about food is when we talk about other materials, we say reduce, reuse, and recycle. But when we talk about food, because so much of the work's been framed around reduction to landfill, reduce means sort of any and all of the above, which really flattens the hierarchy. And I talk to a lot of folks about generation, like, well, it's too hard to measure. How do you even do that? Well, we're kind of already doing it. So everything after, and do not confuse, I'm not trying to say donation is reuse. I'm just using this to illustrate the reuse, reduce, reuse, recycle component of other materials. But after reducing wasted food in the first place through prevention and donating it to people, all the other solutions are really around recycling and recovery rates, which are more diversion-based. A lot of that data is already collected, so we have it. The only 2 areas that reduce the generation of wasted food are prevention and donation. And you can get to generation by combining what's disposed to landfill with what's recovered through other systems, including animal feed. And in order to support this work long term, we've had to develop new measurement. So that's it's a large part of what I've been doing at DEQ is developing a methodology so states, cities, counties can actually develop more granular baselines and develop more effective policy solutions that kind of de-risk infrastructure investment. So you're right-sizing infrastructure without, 20 years from now, we don't want to be growing food to feed systems that more efficiently destroy it. So the study was set out to figure out how much edible food is discarded, how and why was it wasted, and really look at root causes, and what practices can actually reduce wasted food in the first place. And out of that, we want to help develop methods that are reliable and less expensive than what we invested in, because we were doing methodology development, that can allow others to develop baselines and assess progress longitudinally, not only in diversion, but also in reducing the generation of waste. And this business case here is from the Champions 12.3 business report, where you've probably heard that 14-to-1 return on investment for businesses. But this is the return on investment for investing in prevention through a government. And this is basically the return on investment using the UK data you heard the woman today from DEFRA talk about. So I won't get into the household results. I'll be publishing these results before I wrap up in October, and I'm happy to share them in advance. Not on the website, but I've given permission once it's finalized in July to share some of these results. Of the food that was tossed out at a household level, 3/4 of it was edible. Of the food composting, about half of it was edible. And the theory of change that if you do source separation, you see food that's being wasted that didn't need to be wasted, didn't really play out. We did a bunch of ethnographic interviews, we did a statewide survey. Basically, people felt so much less guilty about disposing of food to compost, they didn't even see the opportunity to reduce it. Same went for leftovers and things that they froze. It was kind of like it was a sunk cost, which is really interesting. And I don't think that means we shouldn't be doing composting or digestion. It just means we should probably be messaging it in a way that doesn't impede prevention efforts. And those are just some of the per capita results. So feel free to refer to those slides. So how is that measurement study going to support this broader work around preventing the wasting of food? Well, it's fed directly into some commercial campaigns we just designed and launched. It's called Wasted Food, Wasted Money. It's a statewide campaign for all local governments that's being implemented with commercial partners. And it's also part of a partnership with Oregon Metro, which is a regional government around Portland with about 26 cities and counties. And we have foodwastestopswithme.org is the site. So there's lots of resources, and some of the case studies I've worked on to prove out the return on investment and environmental benefits of different prevention strategies in a business are included there. And those should be published probably in the next couple of months. We're just finalizing them now. What we're also doing is some messaging research. So we're about to issue an RFP next month that'll go out to the people who do political polling to figure out how do you message prevention and composting in a way where the recovery message doesn't preclude prevention opportunities. That hasn't been done yet, and we think that's really important. A lot of this work will also feed into consumer campaigns that will be designed later next year that build upon Save the Food and Food Too Good to Waste that's developed by EPA. We're doing a food rescue research study I'm leading pretty much independently at this point. It's a life cycle assessment of the environmental, economic, and nutritional trade-offs of different pathways to source food and redistribute that. So we can kind of think about what's the best way to feed people. And a best practices toolkit, sort of like a best practices 3.0, of this laundry list, which are seem to be the most effective. And while this won't be coming to a theater near you, what you can expect in October is a series of protocols for governments and businesses across the supply chain. I'm also one of 3 experts appointed to the US government through a group Claudia Fabiano works on called the Commission for Environmental Cooperation. We're developing a bunch of protocols that will align with hopefully what we're doing in Oregon. And we're comparing our results to NRDC's results and RAP's results and EU Fusion's. So maybe there's enough consistency that we can kind of make some conclusions across the board without having to do a lot of measurement. And what action areas require more of our collective action? In each of the reports, the list of future research needs is long, so there's a lot of opportunity to build on this work. And before I wrap up, I just wanted to point out that the Food Waste Reduction Alliance, I was an advisor to them for a while, and they've really come around on this. This was a slide from the head of the Food Marketing Institute at Waste Expo that I borrowed, Andy Herrick, who works with Laura Abshire, who's the lead for NRA, one of the key partners in this group. And they've had a lot of leadership in this space, and they're really coming around to see the importance of doing measurement. They also need help tracking. We really don't have the tools yet. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to do this together. And it can't be a one-off. It's not something you just do. It really needs to be culturally integrated. So I think that's the next step after you have these insights is how do you drive change and really make it actionable across the supply chain. So when you think about collecting data, I don't recommend anyone develops programs or do measurement unless you really think about the higher level why for your organization, for your stakeholders, and for the higher level environmental goals you're trying to achieve, because we're all on this learning journey together. And I'll just close with this quote from Amory Levins. I think it's really brilliant, and I hope it inspires you to think about how you can integrate prevention into your professional and personal lives so we can really drive action there. I feel like everyone theoretically agrees with prevention, but we've done very little to track outcomes and invest in it in more holistic ways. So thanks for letting me share that with you.
Great, thank you, Ashley. So great, we have about 20 minutes to have a conversation, and I'd really like to maybe pose one question to the panelists, but then I'd like you to, as Emily said, tee up your questions. No deer in the headlights looks. So if you would tee up your questions for the panelists, because that's one thing I really want to do is have you reach out to the other folks in the room. So when we were putting together the panel, we had talked about some of the opportunities for examples of collaborations and coalitions. And based on what you've heard here today, do you have any ideas that you'd like to pursue for collaborations or future collaborations? And anyone want to jump on that one?
Chris is looking at me, so I can get started. Yeah, so some ideas that we've had for collaboration. So in Rhode Island, what works best for us is when we have kind of like public-private partnerships. So if the state says, we're just going to do this, that rarely works. And then if members of the public move forward with something, that often, that works. But if we have kind of the statewide goals, and we kind of do it in a coordinated way, that tends to be what moves things forward most quickly. And so we've done a few partnerships, and I'm excited to see what other ones might exist or other folks in the room. Some things that have worked really well for us so far. So one is this 5-university collaborative that we've done around food waste reduction. And that has been around, giving them tools to track and measure, and now following up with information about, okay, you still have food waste, obviously. How do we provide you with other resources? So hearing from them what they need, us trying to provide, and going back and forth. We'll be collaborating with EPA and other partners, including Johnson Wales University, the Hospitality Association, others, to kind of bring these types of conversations together. That's worked well in the past. In partnership with Johnson Wales, again, we did a really great event probably like a year and a half ago now, but bringing together folks kind of from across the food waste chain to say what needs to be done, what's been working really well, what hasn't been working, what do we need, and that spawned another conversation, again, mostly from universities, who are some of our largest food waste producers in the state, or large institutions who produce food waste, that had their own conversation they brought together around both food waste reduction, but also issues of hunger and food insecurity on campus, and how do we connect all of this wasted food that universities are producing with folks on their campus who are really in need, and folks who surround their campuses who are really in need. So most of our campuses are in our urban core, surrounded by lots of folks in need. So really seeing these opportunities to kind of bring together disparate voices. And one other thing I'll say is that I think being able to look at waste as part of this like coordinated food strategy has been a great way to bring folks to the table who otherwise wouldn't be at the table. So for example, when we released the food strategy a year ago, I had some great conversations with the Department of Health, who I love, and they were like, hey, we think we might be a barrier, and that really stinks. Like, what is going on? Like, we regulate these businesses, we are in all of them all the time, we know they're wasting food, that hurts our hearts, but we think we're the problem, and how do we stop being the problem? And I was like, oh my God, I'm so excited that you're at the table. And so they were really excited to say, hey, these are important goals. We want to be part of the solution, and we think we're not right now. And so being able to frame it in a way, where we have big goals and bring people to the table in a way that's like inclusive has been a really effective way to get a lot of engagement. So I'll stop there.
That's great. I wish we had one of you in every governor's office. I found it to be really challenging to collaborate with other agencies at a state level environmental agency. There's just a lot of hoops to jump through for everyone involved. And one of the collaborations we're really proud of is partnering with the Oregon Restaurant and Lodging Association and the Oregon Metro Regional Group of Regional Governments to actually develop collateral together for businesses. And it supports the landfill ban, but also prioritizes prevention and donation resources, so it seems to be a really good win-win. I'm also working with the Pacific Coast Collaborative, so it's the group of governors through all the West Coast states, plus the premier in BC, and the mayors of the 5 major cities, including in Vancouver, BC. And we're looking at launching a commitment for a really exciting collaboration that potentially engages industry at the Global Climate Action Summit this September. Can't really share much more beyond that, but I hope you stay tuned and track that effort. We're also looking at ways to measure baselines and taking action more meaningfully. So as part of the work I'm doing, I'm reaching out to other local governments and even other states to figure out, hey, if you're about to measure, how can we integrate maybe a survey or a diary or something that complements your efforts so you start to get a better sense of edible or avoidable waste versus inedible scraps. And the last piece I'll mention relates to the food rescue study I already mentioned briefly, and that's just to rethink the best way to feed people and address the root causes of hunger. And we're doing that in collaboration with Feeding America partners like the Oregon Food Bank to really rethink, is the existing approach of creating a whole secondary redistribution sector outside of the market-based economy the best long-term path? How do you address the short-term needs of food insecurity without perpetuating them long-term? So I think there's a lot of opportunity to collaborate there as well.
I think from our perspective, we're how do we dive deeper into this issue and move forward? We've been doing a couple of areas I would like to collaborate more, and it sound kind of bad because I'm sitting here trying to collaborate. I'd like to collaborate more with my own Department of Agriculture. And it's tough. It's actually, I find it harder to collaborate with someone within the own state government than I do without, out with the business industry, the industry out there and working on this issue. So it is a one where we have to coordinate, and we have been working with them, but I think that, we have to align those various goals, and they are, as you've seen, they do align very well. I think the other piece we've done through Recycling Works is in a sense of collaborating with boards of health, getting them on the same page, trying to have a consistent approach as to how someone's going to view food waste and how they're going to address it from their role as the health agent, but how it can play in with the collection or the diversion infrastructure that we have. And lastly, we have worked a lot and continue to try and look at new opportunities on how to integrate, work with, and support industry activities to reduce, their generation of food waste or the food that's wasted, and look at, what kind of systems can they put into place that will improve their buying habits, stretch their food longer, but serve the same purposes. And it is tough. Sometimes you're in a silo, and we are looking at the infrastructure here that we have in Massachusetts. We're very happy with where it is, but obviously there can always be improvements. And as you move away from getting stuff away from the trash, and you start to move it, as it moves up, the dollar exponential value of that just grows. So, as you get, so maybe, you can work from the top down, you work from the bottom up. We've started with the bottom up saying don't throw it away, and what we're seeing is, a lot of activity starting to move up the chain higher and higher. And I think companies will start to recognize the value of that. Well, I saved some money when I composted it, but guess what? I save even more money when I don't generate as much, and my buying habits are better. And they kind of start, once it's on their mind that they need to start thinking about this particular material, they do get pretty inventive.
Great. For the audience, anyone have a question? Please.
Thank you so much for your expertise, Ashley and Sue, for focusing on food system and upstream efforts. Really applaud you for that, and for Greg for the years of expertise that you provide to the table and all the amazing resources that you provided in the community for technical assistance. I'm curious about whether you looked at procurement strategies, especially around like plant-based eating and promoting less carbon-intense foods, and the connectivity, especially Ashley, with food waste reduction. Currently we're promoting the Good Food Procurement Policy, which is, there's an active campaign in 14 communities across the states, and waste reduction is one of the strategies, but obviously healthier eating is healthier planet. So I'm just wondering if there's connectivity with waste reduction in terms of changing consumer behaviors. And also my other question is, have you guys engaged with the NPO in your region about coordinated infrastructure planning in different jurisdictions in your region?
Anyone want to jump in?
I can start on the plant-based diet piece. So it's a really interesting question, because hands down, what's most frequently wasted, both at consumer and commercial levels, are fruit and vegetables. So when we think about plant-based diets, it's something that's out of scope for the Department of Environmental Quality, although I know others are working on it. And I think one of the questions we have is, well, what do you mean by plant-based? Some of my colleagues came from the LCA community, and I know the LCA for texturized pea protein, for example, is about the same as the LCA for beef. So it's just something to keep in mind when you think about plant-based diet choices. And there's also, for procurement, we're looking at how do you create feedback loops through measurement. So I really always think about how do you make measurement actionable at the facility level and find a way to aggregate it to tell a statewide success story. But if you only pander to telling the statewide success story, you never really have an actionable data set below it. So it's like measurement with a purpose. And we want to see more feedback loops created to chefs and through purchasers and through catering managers. And I think the World Wildlife Fund's Hotel Kitchen Toolkit gets at some of that in a really useful way, so that's a place to look. And when I was at EPA, I co-led a group called the West Coast Climate Forum, and we actually have a climate-friendly purchasing toolkit with a whole food module, and that's intended to crosswalk the drive of sustainability folks into the language of procurement folks to make it really easy. And it's not just food, and it's all done through a greenhouse gas lens. We couldn't find anything out there on procurement that wasn't through a lens of toxicity, which is also important. And oftentimes greenhouse gases act as a surrogate, so there's a lot of commonality between strategies. But that resource is pretty neat. And it also includes things that cities purchase a lot of, like concrete and asphalt and electronics and contractual services. So that's the resource I would recommend. I don't know if anyone else has more to add on the plant-based comment.
Yeah, the only thing else I'll add is, so for plant-based in particular, we haven't done a lot. I would love to explore with you some of the work that you guys have been doing, because that's a particular interest of mine personally. What we have been connecting folks to mostly and have longer-term plans to continue with is more local and regional procurement, and Rhode Island as a whole isn't growing a lot of farm-raised animal proteins. We do land a large quantity of seafood, but less like farm-raised animals. And so that footprint is smaller. And in general, we subscribe to the Food Solutions New England 50 by 60 goal, which says that 50% of the food grown, eaten in the region will have been grown, harvested, whatever, bless you, in the region by 2060. As a region, we're at about 10% now. For the state of Rhode Island, we're at like 2%. So room for growth. But if you've seen that report put out by Food Solutions New England, it does, in order to achieve that, it does shift us to kind of different diets. Like we can't eat the same really meat-centered diets that we do now and expect to be able to procure 50% of our food from our region by 2060, and has us move toward more plant-based, as well as relying more on our sea proteins as well. And so that's been a big push that we've had, is connecting, especially our larger institutions, but to more local procurement, options. And so that's a partnership we also have with our Commerce Agency, which is also our Economic Development Corporation. It's called different things in different states. Ours is called Commerce Rhode Island, but it's the EDC that you guys all have. They have a really great program called Supplier Eye, which also recognizes that there's lots of other things they could be procuring locally, like you mentioned concrete and whatnot. Food is a component of that big local push, and a lot of our state's largest employers and companies are part of the Supplier Eye initiative. And food has been one of the major focuses that's moving most quickly. And so it's more regional than plant-based, but also what's being grown, especially in Rhode Island, isn't particularly meat-based. So there is some of that as well. I don't know if, Greg, you have anything you want to?
That's fair, Greg. Another question in the back, or Joe, did you have a question? Sure, go ahead.
Sure. Hi, I'm Kat from Australia. Delighted to be here to hear what you're up to with food waste in the US. I was really interested, Greg, to hear about the landfill ban on commercial businesses. And I was just wondering the cost dynamic for businesses. Did it cost them more to have an organic service collection versus landfill? Or was it about the same, or did they actually make savings when they had to introduce the organics?
Well, we did a lot of research on the front end and working with supermarkets and other larger generators, and it went into the design of where that ban point would be. We put it at 1 ton disposed of a week. The data probably said it was cost effective at 2 tons and not below that, but we decided, you know what, that's under the existing infrastructure that's there. And anyone who, when you put it at 1 ton, if you generate 2 tons, you're going to say I just generated 1.8. So conceptually, we were talking about all these people who generate anywhere from 1 ton to 1.9 tons, and we wanted to get a lot of those in. And so, in essence, I would say for the most part, there's some investment in the in-house operation component, training staff, setting up the kind of operation to deal with the material. But once that is done, and once that's trained and in place, what we found is if you're generating over a ton for disposal, you should be able to cost effectively divert that material through some sort of separation program. And that's kind of panned out. If it hadn't panned out, I'm sure I would have heard about it. Somebody would have been screaming about costing a lot more money. But once again, it has to do with that inchworm and that infrastructure and making sure that that's there, because the minute that infrastructure falls in a certain, falls apart in one area or the other, the cost is going to rise. But no, overall, we've had, a lot of the questions come up, oh, when are you going to lower the band? And, well, we want to see what happens. We're still kind of measuring and seeing where that activity is going and how the cost effectiveness, how that curve is working. But I think, overall, most folks that were implementing it, certainly, supermarkets, I think we're saving, 10 to 15 grand a year per store. So, it was real dollars for a lot of these guys.
And Lorenzo from Recycling Works Massachusetts has some case studies on this exact thing. And Lorenzo, do you want to add anything to the conversation?
Yeah, we do have lots of case studies that demonstrate everything from being about break even to saving, fairly substantial amounts of money. And I think, especially as you add on sort of multiple strategies within the hierarchy, those numbers get better and better. And so the more strategies you can employ across the hierarchy, the better off the cost profile tends to get. But at a baseline, even if all you're doing is, say, composting, you're seeing break even for the most part around the threshold level.
And like I said, I have the pleasure of working with all our New England states, and Vermont, for example, has a phase-in ban to 0 to the household over time. So that one is the most progressive in terms of literally getting down to 0. And I believe, what is the date on that now, Ann?
July 1st,
2020. So that's a little bit different strategy than the other states.
Do you mind if I ask a follow-up question?
Of course.
You said the technical assistance was really key in providing support to businesses to be able to understand how to divert their waste. How much investment in dollars did you spend in that? Can you share that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I would say, we hire Recycling Works to do a lot of business technical assistance. We do grants, but it's across the spectrum of operations. It's not just food waste, it's all waste. So it'd be hard to kind of parse out the actual dollar amounts, but, if I hadn't, back of the envelope, if I had to say, and it's one of the reasons why I think this study can be very helpful for this economic study can be very helpful for others, because if I had to guess, I'm spending $1 million a year, and I'm getting $175 million worth of economic activity. And it seems to me like somebody should be nodding their head at the Economic Development Agency and saying, okay, let's do this. So.
Thank you very much.
Madeline.
Greg, I would just add that when MassDEP sends out a letter of, like, we found some stuff in your waste stream that shouldn't be there, whether it's organic or something else, that letter goes out, which is a little scary to get, but it immediately, within it refers to CET, Recycling Works. So it immediately moves them into a technical assistance, nice kind of mode, which I think is a great strategy.
Great.
Eventually.
Not the first time.
Not the first time.
Well,
And-
there's two different kinds, there's a lot of different kinds of, enforcement, but for the most part, they get a notice of non-compliance, come back into order, and then the next time around, they're gonna be seeing some dollars attached to it. But, for the most part, a lot of these guys, I mean, the reality is in the waste area, when you look at someone's operating, costs and you look at the bottom line about what portion of their costs are driven by their disposal,
It's
it's
tiny.
1/2 of 1%.
Yeah,
So until you shake it in somebody's face, they're not paying attention to it. But once they do, they go, oh, yeah, okay, I can divert cardboard, yeah, and I'll save some money. Wow, or I can divert food waste and save some money. It's just a fact of an overall operation, someone's, priority list. When it's
Great.
1% of your budget, it's going to be down on the list.
Great. So I think that we're at 4 o'clock. I know we're supposed to be in the other room. So thank you for joining us, and give our panelists a hand. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Always